We know how to calculate our margin of error when we're talking about means. We just multiply the standard deviation divided by the square root of n times the z-score. We've done that a bunch of times already. We're going to need to do the same thing when we're dealing with proportions. The difference is that when we're dealing with a mean, we're usually given the standard deviation of the population, or we're given the standard deviation of the sample, so we have that to work with. When we're dealing with a proportion, the standard deviation is not going to be given, but it's very, very easy to calculate. And it's going to be just the square root of p times q over n. Now remember from probabilities, p was the probability of success. So when we're dealing with proportions, p is going to be the percentage of the population that fits our description, the ones we would consider to be successes. And Q is going to be the ones we would consider to be failures. So in this situation here, we survey 100 people, 30 say yes, and we want 90% confidence. To calculate our standard deviation, we take the square root of the proportion that we count as successes. That's going to be our 30 out of 100, or 0.3. Right? It's always going to be a decimal between 0 and 1. And we're going to multiply it by the proportion of failures, which is always just going to be 1 minus that. So 0.7. And then we're going to divide by the number of people in the survey itself. Okay? That divided by the square root of n is the same as it was before when we're dealing with means. So here we would do 0.3 times 0.7 divided by 100. And that gives us 0.0021. And I want to do you can do second square root. And then if you do second minus, it'll bring that number back in, or you can type it in and it'll give us 0.0458. So here our standard deviation is going to be 0.0458. And remember, we would multiply 1.64 times that to get the margin of error. So our margin of error here is going to be that times 1. They say 64. 64 is right, isn't it? I remember my three little numbers. So our margin of error is going to be 0.075. Now, we're not at the entire confidence interval yet, but this may seem like a very small number. But remember, we're trying to guesstimate the percentage of the population that answered yes to whatever question this was. And this is a margin of error of 7.5%. So that's actually quite a wide margin of error. If you were hearing a study that said, 30% of people, blah, 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 with a margin of error of 7%, well, that's almost between 20 and 40. That's not terribly confidence inspiring. So let's look at another one. Let's say we look at 25 eggs. And we find that, let's go with 10 of them have spots. Eggs used to be brown and they used to be speckly. I'm not sure I've seen a brown egg in a long time. But context really doesn't matter here. So we got 25 eggs, 10 have spots, and we want 95% confidence interval, and we're just looking at the margin of error here. Okay, so our margin of error is going to be the z-score for 95%, which is 1.96. Oh, forgot to mention, when we're dealing with proportions, we don't have to determine z-score or t-score. It's always going to be z. So this formula will work all of the time. It's going to be 1.96 times the square root of, what is p here? P is going to be 10 divided by 25. That's going to be 0.4. So 0.4 times 1 minus 0.4 is 0.6. Right? 40% have spots, 60% don't. Divided by, we got 25 eggs total. Okay, so that's our formula for margin of error. To put it into the calculator is easy. I suggest this process, 0.4 times 0.6 divided by 25. Put that in the calculator, and then do the square root of 0.0096, and then multiply that by 1.96. And we get a margin of error of 0.192. Now that's actually 19.2%. That's a really wide margin of error if we're talking about proportions. That's just under 20%. So our confidence interval is going to be 40%, right? Because that was our P, plus or minus 20%. So we're saying somewhere between 20 and 60%. That's ridiculously wide, but that's because we have a very small sample and a relatively high confidence. Right? So that's the margin of error. Next time we're going to move on to the confidence interval itself, and of course, let the calculator do some of the work.